Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. The roles played by women in theater in the United States have been varied, from playwrights and performers to critics and members of the audience. Now, the Beinecke Library at Yale University is sharing some of the stories of these women in an exhibit called Brava, Women Make American Theater, which runs through July 3rd, 2022. Today, we're joined by Dr. Melissa Barton. She's the curator of drama and prose at the Yale Collection of American Literature, as well as one of the lead creators of the exhibit. Melissa, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, this exhibit isn't just chronicling the contributions that women made as theater artists, but it's also about how, to quote you, stage performance often mirrored, but also frequently challenged and changed understandings of women's roles and of women's rights in larger U.S. society. So why did you feel taking that more expansive perspective was so important?
Well, just to give a little bit of background, the exhibit was originally conceived as a complement or companion to the celebrations of coeducation that were planned at Yale in the year leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 1919 and 1920, it was the 50th anniversary of coeducation in Yale College, and it's also the 150th anniversary of Yale School of Art, which was always coeducational. And so there were celebrations kind of planned all over campus. And I proposed this exhibit partly to showcase some recent acquisitions of women theater artists that had been made in the last 10 years, that I made in the last 10 years, and partly to kind of just participate in that celebration. And what I found when I was planning it, my background isn't really in gender studies, and I was struggling not to make it kind of just a parade of examples. I didn't want it to feel like a listicle. And so this phrasing that you just quoted, that mirrored and also frequently challenged and changed was really the barest kind of theme that I could come up with. It's very hard to generalize about women in theater over 2 centuries. And I tend to shy away from generalizations anyway, but that was kind of the closest thing to a generalization that I felt like I could make about it. So that was why I phrased it that way. I wanted there to be lots of examples. There are lots of examples from across the collections. And then I was kind of struggling against myself, trying to figure out what it is I was trying to say.
Now, one of those changes that your exhibit addresses is the rise in the number of women going to the theater, which really seems to have taken off in the 19th century. What drove that change, and how did that in turn affect the theater in the 1800s?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating thing that I learned about, especially from a book by Cheryl Dudden that I'm not going to get the title quite right, but I have it in the bibliography for the suggested readings for the exhibit that's about women in theater in the 19th century. And she has a chapter about this phenomenon, which is really fascinating. I think that there are a multiplicity of factors that kind of bring women into theater audiences. One of those is this question of the question of respectability in attending the theater, which becomes more and more palatable to middle class and upper middle class women by the kind of antebellum period. And theaters are founded specifically to cater to women. The museum theater phenomenon is a part of this. So the Boston Museum and P.T. Barnum's American Museum were both founded as a kind of range of attractions, some of which were kind of like almost an alibi for women to be able to then go into the theater while they're there, kind of. And then in response to this, there's a genre shift to melodrama as a kind of primary genre that's being performed and written for U.S. stages that is really, catering to women, more plays that were called moral dramas, which is the kind of tagline that was always used with Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a phenomena as a novel, but also as a stage play, an adapted stage play from the novel, done without Harriet Beecher Stowe's authorization or consent. So that whole kind of nexus of phenomena of kind of this rise of the middle class cultural consumption, it's all tied up with women going to the theater, which I think is really beautifully explored in this book by Cheryl Dudden, but also, you can really see it in the materials in our collections.
So in addition to tracking changes in how society thought about women attending the theater, the exhibit also chronicles the changing place of women on stage. There was widespread moral concern about women appearing on stage during the colonial era and the early republic, but you say that when it comes to the 1800s, and I'm quoting you directly here, the story of 19th century women on the United States stage is a story of legs. Can you explain what that means?
I love this story, and I have to credit, and I'm sorry, I think I misspoke earlier and got her name wrong. It's Faye Dudden, Faye Dudden, who wrote this great book about 19th century women in the 19th century theater. And so I credit her again with teaching me about this phenomenon. But this question of basically what we began with, this question of like, is women's participation on stage can be read as feminist or should it be read as sexist, right? That's the kind of basic, simple, feminist history question about it. And the leg question is a really big part of that, because the kind of way that the exposure of women's legs evolves, it really tracks with what's happening on the stage. When women are first admitted to perform on stages in the Restoration period in the UK and in Europe, really soon after that, women start cross-dressing on stage and playing male parts in breeches so that they're wearing tights. And that is understood to be a kind of, both kind of transgressive thing, here's a woman playing a man on the stage, but also designed to give people an opportunity to see women's legs. And so you have this kind of go on over centuries. But in the 19th century in the US, these parts, which are called breeches parts, are very popular. One of the woman who is considered the greatest actress of the 19th century, Charlotte Cushman, specialized in breeches parts. But then you also have the introduction of what are eventually going to become chorus lines in the immediate post-Civil War period. And in those, again, women are kind of arrayed on the stage in tableau, wearing really thick woolen tights. And those shows were called leg shows, right? They were thought to be a kind of opportunity, or marketed as an opportunity to see women's bodies on stage. And you could say that this is objectification, but you could also say that it's, a kind of sexual liberation, I think. And so, people have argued both of those things. And the tights get kind of thinner and sheerer over the next about 50 years until you see the, chorus lines begin to emerge in the early 20th century. And so I think it's a really fascinating kind of story, and it makes for a great kind of array of photographs. And so and then the kick line and that choreography kind of emerges in the in the teens and 20s as well.
You mentioned how it's so hard to draw generalizations. It's such a broad subject, women in American theater over the centuries. But one particular strength of Beinecke's holdings is this really important collection, the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters. It sounds like you've drawn some really wonderful material from that collection to tell the stories of some important and underappreciated figures, the Hyers sisters and Ada Overton Walker, among many others. Who were some of these women, and how does knowing about them help enrich our understanding of the role Black women played in theater in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in particular?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I'm very proud and honored to be one of the curators of the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection. It's a collection that really focuses on African American creations and contributions to culture and literature. And one of its real strengths is in the history of drama. The collection was founded in honor of James Weldon Johnson, and he himself was very interested in, enamored of drama, and friends with many dramatists, including the Williams and Walker Company. He was friends with Burt Williams, and he was interested in the history of theater. And his book, Black Manhattan, which is about the history of Black New York, is very focused on the history of performance in Black performance in New York. And so, I knew that I wanted there to be a lot about the history of Black theater in the exhibit as a whole. And I was trying to pull on all the examples I could of Black women performers. The Hyers sisters were Anna Maida and Emma Louise Hyers. They were performing sisters. They were often billed together as the Hyers sisters. There's an S on the end of their name. The S is often omitted in playbills featuring them. Anna Maida was a soprano, and Emma was a contralto and also a comedian. And they had their own troupe that was built around them as performers. That was a kind of proto-variety or vaudeville act. And they collaborated with others to create what is sometimes considered the first Black musical, which is called Out of Bondage. It was first performed with that title. It had some other iterations, but first performed with that title in 1876. So very early musical that was, we often think of something like Oklahoma as being the first musical that has an integrated songs integrated into its story. But Out of Bondage has that too, 50 some years before, or 60 some years before. And so they were really incredible performers. And there's a lot of really interesting stories. I shouldn't say a lot, but there is a really interesting story to be told. And some people have. Daphne Brooks, in her wonderful book, Bodies in Descent, talks quite a bit about them as people who are very savvy about their own image, about their kind of working as people in the theater business, but also as performers, and very influential in that way as innovators. You could say all of that and more about Ada Overton Walker, who was famously called Queen of the Cakewalk. That was her specialty. She was the choreographer and the star dancer of the Williams and Walker troupe. She was married to George Walker, and she was, active about a generation after the Higher Sisters, kind of at the turn of the 20th century. Incredibly influential as a style icon, as a dancer, as a choreographer, as a performer. And, for decades afterwards, one thing I say in the exhibit is that 2 decades later, James Weldon Johnson, in writing Black Manhattan, is still saying she's the greatest performer that ever was. So she is incredible. I really wanted to feature her. And we're fortunate to have just a few photographs of her that James Weldon Johnson had in his papers. And so we were able to include her as well. And I wanted to also make the point that these women, again, they were innovators, and that those innovations were often, at risk of, and then ended up being co-opted into American musical theater on stages that excluded Black performers, in chorus lines that excluded Black performers, and that these were their innovations, and they should be credited with making those innovations.
Now, as we move into the 20th century, women take on crucial roles in organizations, some of which listeners may have heard of, the Provincetown Players, the Theater Guild, the Federal Theater Project. Could you tell us about some of these women and perhaps how understanding their stories complicates and enriches our understanding of these historically important organizations?
Yeah, I think that this is where I really wanted to make a pretty straightforward argument about representation and inclusion and recognition in our histories of these organizations. We tend to think of these organizations in association with the men who worked with them and came out of them. This is a kind of really the most kind of feminist history story I would be telling would be about these companies. The group theater was co-founded by Cheryl Crawford. The Theater Guild was co-founded by a woman named Helen Wesley, and Teresa Helburn, helmed it with Lawrence Langner for its entire history. And so, just wanting to highlight their labor that often went under-recognized, in part because it was gendered. And so to really, this seemed like a moment to really hit that home in the history of these organizations. The Provincetown Players, if you look at the rosters of them, there's a great history of women in the Provincetown Players by Cheryl Black. But if you look at the rosters of the Provincetown Players, it's 50% women. So it's not Eugene O'Neill's company, right? It was founded by Susan Glaspell and George Graham Cook together, and the women, they were not only involved, they were also putting on plays about free love and sexuality and these kinds of really edgy things that we don't always remember if we're thinking about the C plays. So this kind of like heart of kind of American stage history seemed like a really important moment to really just name these people and say, hey, remember Teresa Helburn. Oklahoma was Teresa Helburn's idea. So I want to just say that that was my idea here.
One other thing, I think it's really interesting that you're highlighting this particular phenomenon in the exhibit is this very crucial element of the history of women in American theater, which is mentorships. You're talking about how representation, it's sort of the contributions of a Teresa Helburn or a Susan Glaspell are so underappreciated. And the ways in which actors, playwrights, other artists help sort of teach and bring up the next generation of women artists and theater personnel is so important. What are some of the relationships that the exhibit features, and why were they so important?
Yeah, I mean, theater is really a guild genre, a guild profession, and it's really about apprenticeships. And so those partnerships and mentoring relationships are really important. It was kind of hard in the way I wound up organizing the exhibit. The Beinecke Library has fixed exhibition cases, and the architecture kind of demands organizing exhibits in a certain way. And it was hard to draw some of these parallels just because of how I organized it. But I did mention it in the introductory materials and also in some of the text these really important relationships. Somebody who is not heavily featured in the exhibit, but I wanted to kind of pull out and mention her, is Hallie Flanagan, who was the director, forgetting her exact title, but the executive, director of the Federal Theater Project, went on to direct the theater programs at Vassar College and Smith. And she, especially while she was with the Federal Theater Project, really mentored a lot of up and coming directors and producers and playwrights. One of those who is featured in the exhibit is Shirley Graham, who went on to marry W.E.B. Du Bois. So she is often styled as Shirley Graham Du Bois. Shirley Graham, after working on the Federal Theater Project under Hallie Flanagan's leadership, went on to go to Yale School of Drama and study playwriting. And so those kinds of relationships, in that kind of national scope, the one time that we've ever had a national theater, I wanted to show Eva Le Gallienne's work. We have some of Eva Le Gallienne's papers at the Beinecke. The rest of her archive is in the New York Public Library. And she was incredibly influential. She directed a young Uta Hagen. Hers was the first company that Irene Sheriff, the costume designer, designed for. And Sheriff is featured in the exhibit. We have her papers. So Eva Le Gallienne was really influential in kind of mentoring and directing younger especially actors. And I also, of course, highlighted Paula Vogel, whose papers are at Beinecke. Paula is still working, about to have How I Learned to Drive premiere on Broadway 25 years after it was first produced. But Paula is the first to say that she considers herself both a playwright and a teacher. And she has had a long career as a professor of playwriting and mentoring relationships with many acclaimed playwrights. Many of her mentees are themselves award-winning playwrights. Those include Sarah Rule and Lynn Nottage and many others. And so I really wanted to highlight that teaching that Paula Vogel has done.
You're also taking an admirably inclusive view and approach in designing this exhibit. I'm especially interested in the Laura Bailey collection. What is this collection, and what have you included from it in the exhibit, and why?
So the full name of the Laura Bailey collection, which will tell you a little bit about what it is the Laura Bailey Collection of Gender and Transgender Materials. Laura Bailey is an amazing human rights activist and collector of materials that showcase gender fluidity, gender nonconformity, unexpected gender presentations of many, many different kinds. And one of the areas that she's focused on in her collecting, and it's a huge collection at Beinecke, of both printed materials and photographs and ephemera of all different kinds. One of the areas that Laura Bailey has focused on over her years of collecting, her collection came to Beinecke in 2010. And is the history of gender on stage and how gender has been performed. And I wanted this exhibit not to be entirely about cisgendered women. I wanted it to acknowledge the complexity of gender and the conversation that's being had about gender in the 21st century, and had been being had all along over centuries, especially on the stage. And so I cited, somebody made fun of me about this, but I cited Judith Butler in the label text to kind of just acknowledge this idea that gender and performance have long been considered to be entwined in various ways. And so the part of Laura Bailey's collection that I am featuring showcases these, in most cases, cross-gender performances, cross-dressed performance, female impersonation, drag in Laura Bailey's collection.
So you've been talking about some of the highlights of this exhibit, and some of the just general approaches. But I'm curious, you work with these items day in and day out. Do you have any personal favorites, perhaps especially ones that are currently on display?
It's hard, curators are supposed to be like parents and say, I don't have any favorites. Something that is a favorite of mine, in general, is the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection and the History of Black Performance. That's what my dissertation research was about. And so I love that material. I love this letter I have a lot of material in the collection. This is probably my favorite thing, about Rose McClendon, who was an incredible performer of mostly melodrama in the 20s and 30s in the Harlem Renaissance period. She was, played Serena in Porgy, the play Porgy, which Porgy and Bess is based on. She also starred in several other melodramas about Black life written by white Southern men. But really her dream was to create a theater company in Harlem. And she realized that dream very briefly right before her death. She died of lung disease very young. And that theater was called the Negro People's Theater in Harlem. And their first production was a all Black cast production of Waiting for Lefty, which she wasn't in, but she gave a curtain speech. And she writes this letter. The thing that I was going to say is my favorite is she writes this letter to Langston Hughes. It's the one letter that she wrote to Hughes that says that she wants him to write a full-length play for their next production. And she says that she wants something a little pink, if you know what I mean, which I think is this wonderful encapsulation of kind of the way that leftist ideas and leftist theater is kind of being addressed in this period, even by people who are kind of, we think of as being more in the mainstream, like Rose McClendon. And she's just incredibly beautiful. And, reportedly, I don't know of any video of her performing, but, she's a very powerful performer.
We've been sort of talking about the content of this exhibit. We've been talking about some of the ideas behind it. I'm just wondering what it takes on a practical level to put something like this together. How do you go from, you mentioned having the initial concept to commemorate the anniversary, all the way down to the final stages of assembling everything you're going to feature, explaining it to an audience. What's that whole process like?
Well, it's a very drawn out process, I think, or more drawn out than most people would think of. It's the official calendar length of it is about 2 years, but the concept usually is kind of brewing before that 2-year kickoff begins. We collaborate. So the curator who plans the exhibit, and either working alone or in concert with others, but in this case I worked alone, selects all of the materials by researching them in the collection. There's a kind of object selection deadline that is usually about 8 or 9 months out from the exhibit opening, and we mock up all of the layouts in collaboration with our exhibit production team, which is a couple of people. So the exhibit production team, photographs all of the layouts. They're listed down to the detail, like with number tents and everything, and then the things go into various different kind of workflows where every object that's going to be exhibited is reviewed by the conservators to make sure that it can be safely exhibited for a 6-month period. If it needs conservation treatment of various kinds, binding repair, flattening, all of that kind of stuff happens in that period. Things that need to be photographed, if we're doing a catalog or a booklet or something like that, all of that happens in that time. And so all of that is coordinated by colleagues of mine who are just amazing project managers and are totally brilliant. And then all of that work is done by the conservators and the photographers. And in some cases, we might decide that we want to acquire a book just for the purpose of kind of filling this hole. And so catalogers can be involved too. It's a 50-person. I mean, it's a very involved process, especially for an exhibit of this size. This exhibit has almost 400 objects in it. And so, and then meanwhile, we're writing the text. So we're writing the text and working with a designer to create the text and create other design elements. There's like a banner at the entrance and different kinds of signage and those kinds of things that we work with graphic designers to do. So all of that, it happens, quite a lot further out from when the exhibit is installed than you might imagine. All the mounts are prepared by our exhibit production team, and then they do the installation. So it's a lot.
You mentioned writing up every, the labels and everything, and we'll put this in the show notes, but listeners can actually, even if they're not able to go see the exhibit in person, we'll be able to read all the labels and everything that's on the site for the exhibit. So we'll be sure to make sure that there's a link posted to that in the show notes for this episode. And speaking of which, for those who are able to visit, how do you go about doing that? Where should people go if they're interested in seeing this in person?
Well, thank you. Yes. So Beinecke Library is on Yale's campus. It's on, and you can visit beinecke.library.yale.edu for more information about planning a visit to the library. I'm pleased to share that as of this month, our exhibition hall is open during its formerly regular hours to the public. Our reading room is also, as of this week, open to the public. So for that, people have to complete a vaccine attestation. So I encourage you to look closely at the instructions on our website before showing up. But for the exhibit hall, you can just show up anytime during our open hours, and it's free and open to the public, and you can see it at your leisure.
And visitors might also be aware, and many, I think, people who are listening to this who might have done some research on American theater in the past are probably aware of this. But I understand there's a lot more at Beinecke beyond this exhibit. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit more about some of the theater-related material that's available at the library or available online through the library's website?
Sure. So, in my area, in U.S. literature, Beinecke is very strong in the history of dramatic literature. We have the papers of many playwrights, including, Eugene O'Neill and Thornton Wilder are two of the most frequently consulted collections there, but also Paula Vogel and John Guare, Donald Margulies, so some contemporary playwrights as well. We also have the records of theater companies. So I mentioned the Theater Guild. That's the largest collection in all of the Yale Collection of American Literature. It's enormous. We also have the records of Phoenix Theater. The Living Theater is actually currently closed for processing. When it reopens, it will probably be the largest collection of any collection. But so we have the records of theater companies, and you can often find artists kind of hidden in the records of those companies. So that's always a good place to look for materials. We also have some papers of other theater makers, directors, designers, but historically, dramatic literature and producing companies have been the focus in the American literature collection. We also, in our early modern collection, have, original acting editions, prompt books, and those kinds of things from the early modern period. So that the early modern period is a great period to study at Beinecke as well.
We'll post additional links in our show notes so that you can explore the Beinecke Library's Brava, Women Make American Theater exhibit, as well as more information about the Beinecke's theater-related holdings. Melissa, thank you so much for telling us about this exciting new exhibit.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.